We're picking up this time where we left off in the discussion of the Gihon River and what it means for King Chizkiyahu, King Hezekiah, and for Assyria, for Ashur, and more generally for what it could mean for early passages in the Torah to seemingly be referring to an event that takes place centuries later in the Book of Kings. So there's too much stuff to review from last time, and so we won't go over all of it, but to try to summarize in very brief, what we are arguing is that although people correctly recognize when reading the story of Chizkiyahu and his withstanding the siege of Jerusalem by Sanherib, the king of Assyria, when reading that story, people correctly recognize that it seems to refer back to the splitting of the sea in the time of Moses and Pharaoh, because of some clear textual parallels. Well, what is more strange is that you end up being able to trace some threads that seem to run in the other direction, meaning that when you start by asking about, okay, what does it mean that Chizkiyahu is diverting a water source in Jerusalem called the Gihon? And where did we hear about Gihon before? Well, we heard about the Gihon in the time of Gan Eden. The Gihon River surrounds the land of Cush, and in the Torah, Cush is mentioned in connection with Assyria, Nimrod, and Bavel, and Syria, and Nineveh, but also that the word Gihon is associated with a serpent because Hashem curses the serpent by saying, Al Gihon cha telech, he will crawl on your belly. And then we go over to Chizkiyahu again, and we remember that he destroys the Nachash Nechoshet, or the Nehushtan, in order to remove idolatry from the land. This bronze serpent that Moshe had made. Why did he make a bronze serpent? He made a bronze serpent because the people had been bitten by fiery serpents after complaining about water. And then after he makes this and they're healed, and then there's this song that's sung that begins the same way as the splitting of the sea, Az Yashir, where people sing about digging water channels like princes. And so you have this kind of ping pong back and forth with serpents and water digging and Chizkiyahu and Assyria, and it starts to swirl around the Song of the Sea at the time of Moses, where even we tried to argue that the Ashira, the I will sing, at the beginning of that song may in an interesting way kind of be a play on words that refers to Assyria. So I'm not making all of that argument carefully and methodically right now. I recommend listening to part one of this shiur if you want to hear about that. And so it may sound a bit jumbled and like it's not clear how it all fits together. But if we take all of that as given, we're talking about serpents, we're talking about Assyria and Cush, which is associated with Assyria. We're talking about, and I recognize other people say that Cush is Ethiopia, but in the Torah itself, the clear mention of Cush is in connection with Nimrod and Bavel and Nineveh and Ashur, Assyria. We're talking about Chizkiyahu, we're talking about Gihon, the water source that Chizkiyahu diverted as part of his strategy to withstand the siege of Sanherib. So when you put it all together, now the question is, okay, first of all, the basic claim would be that either prophetically, because if you're willing to read the Torah prophetically, as I think one should be, then there's no reason for another explanation in this case, but either prophetically, or you could make up some other story for yourself that sounds more archaeological if you want, about redaction or about some kind of absorption of the story of Chizkiyahu into the earlier texts of the Torah. But I think it's an irrelevant fantasy in any case, and the main point is we see it there in the text. So I'll assume we're reading it prophetically, which is to say, like, the Torah can contain whatever it wants. It can refer to the past. It can refer to the future. It doesn't matter. So even if we then accept, okay, we've made the case based on the text that the Torah in Sefer Shemot in the time of Moses is referring to what's going to happen with Chizkiyahu and Sancheriv, there's still this question of why. Like, why is that important? Why is that such a big deal that it gets quite prominent billing once you excavate it a little bit in this pivotal moment of the whole Torah, right? The splitting of the sea is the most dramatic moment of the Torah. It's the linchpin around which the whole plot turns, so to speak. It's about Bnei Israel becoming a nation, being saved by the might of Hashem, liberated from Egypt so they can go receive the Torah, go to the land, build the temple, all the things they're meant to do. And the question is, why would you take that and connect dots forward and sort of say, oh, maybe Zeli Anweu means, this is my God and I will make a habitation for him, but Anweu sounds like Anwe, which sounds like Ninwe grammatically. Why is there a reference to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria there? Perhaps what would be the purpose of winking about, oh yeah, later there's going to be this other splitting of the sea moment where Chizkiyahu gets saved. Okay, fine. Lots of splitting of the sea moments happen in Tanakh. When Yehoshua crosses the Jordan, it's sort of a splitting of the sea moment. So, but why build in this sense of the importance of Chizkiyahu? And also, what does it have to do with serpents? What does it have to do with the reference to the serpent in Gan Eden? And also, how do we understand this in light of what Assyria was? Why Assyria, of all the different nations that attacked Israel over the ages, why is Assyria particularly important? So there's maybe a few aspects to an answer that I'll try to lay out and then dig into a little bit more in each aspect. First of all, I think one of the things we have to recognize is the historical significance of the Assyrian Empire for all of humanity. It's not so often talked about today, especially outside of Hebrew Bible contexts. But Assyria did mark kind of a transition in human history in the sense that empires before the Assyrian Empire were more regional and local. Egypt was a great power. You had stuff in Sumeria. They were a great power. But you didn't have this sense of the age of empires where one after the other, the Assyrians and then the Babylonians and then the Persians and then the Greeks and then the Romans, that they were all kind of trying to conquer the whole world if they could. And they kept getting bigger and bigger and swallowing each other up. And that was happening at the crossroads of the three continents in which human civilization sprang into being, right? You also have the Americas and Australia and Antarctica, but they are footnotes in comparison to Africa, Asia, and Europe as far as the early development of human civilizations 3,000 years ago and counting forward from there. And when you view human history and geography in those terms, you realize the land of Israel is at the center of those three continents. It is the crossroads amongst those three continents. And so clearly that is interesting as far as the significance of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. But it also is just interesting with respect to the significance of Assyria. The Assyrians, whether because of technological developments that were more general or because of other kinds of cultural differences for them that gave them some advantage, they really were the first ones who could figure out a way of just sort of steamrolling through land, conquering it, plucking people up, moving them around as was their method, and trying to take over and rule. And what that points to then is that it partly at least shows us that the stakes of what was going on with Chizkiyahu and Assyria were as high as can be, meaning Assyria was going to march through Yerushalayim and erase it in a sense. And there was going to be no more Jewish people, and there was going to be no biblical narrative beyond that point. If things had gone the way they seemed to be going in their natural course. And in retrospect, when we now understand that this was the beginning of the Age of Empires, there was a greater inevitability in some sense that would happen at some point. And that seemingly that would spell the end of the Jewish people and the nation of Israel and all of that. And while it is true that ultimately, as we know, obviously were first conquered by the Babylonians and then later by the Greeks and the Romans, and temples destroyed and all of that, and there was a diaspora and everything else, the Chizkiyahu moment was the first moment where the idea of sovereignty in the land and the divine backing of sovereignty of Am Yisrael in their land was really tested. Everything up until that point had been skirmishes or fights with regional powers that became scourges for a time. The Plishtim, the Philistines, or Ammon or Moab or Edom, whatever. That there obviously are many accounts of other conflicts with different powers in the land of Israel from the time of Joshua and onward. But there isn't quite ever the same sense of this could be the end. It's more like, are you going to be harried by these people? Are you going to be subjugated by these people for a time and then have to sort of repulse them or, expel them from the land when you regain HaKadosh Baruch Hu's favor? But there wasn't, I think, the same sense of there are forces at work happening on a much bigger scale, on a continental scale, and you are just chaff in the wind. And there isn't really any kind of reasonable expectation that your nation and its culture and its commitments and all of that are going to stick around and persist because something's happening that erases everything in its path and replaces it with a different system. That was the meaning of that moment in Yerushalayim for Chizkiyahu. And moreover, that's already what had happened to the northern kingdom, right? Israel, the northern kingdom, had already been erased by Assyria and scattered. And we're still waiting for its reconstitution, right? Like that hasn't really happened in the last several thousand years. So it's a very real possibility that Assyria just erases you. Because that is what happened, not just to other nations, but to the other half of the Israelite nation. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the trend in general, starting with Yehoshua as the sort of denouement of the period of leadership by Moshe, that trend was away from miraculous, direct divine intervention and deliverance and towards the practical requirements of sovereignty and military strategy in the land, right? Even over the course of Sefer Yehoshua gets fewer miracles and has to kind of fight more tactically, and be more practical. And then by the time you get to David HaMelech, there's nothing at all seemingly miraculous about anything that's happening except, a very accurate sling stone or things like that. And so you really get the sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to subsist on miracles in the land. And maybe that means he's kind of hands off. He's stepped away and now, we're supposed to to figure out how to hack it on our own. But Chazal had this famous observation that as time goes on past David, there's actually kind of a backsliding in some ways where David does everything, and then you get to Asa and Yehoshaphat, and then all the way to Chizkiyahu. And by the time you get to Chizkiyahu, he's saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, "You do everything, and I'll just go to sleep, and it will be fine." So Chazal are kind of poking fun at Chizkiyahu a little bit, but Chizkiyahu, the point is Chizkiyahu is a king, a strong king who has great emunah in Hashem, who has done great works to turn the people to Hashem, removing idolatry from the land. And the point is he demonstrates that when you have that kind of zechut, when you have that kind of merit, you can be in the land and you can still merit tremendously miraculous deliverance, right? That this is not just something that happened with Moshe in the desert a long time ago. This is a principle that applies to sovereignty in the land in the time of Jerusalem and the temple and down through the generations of Judaic kings. And so that may be one reason why it's quite important for the Torah to look forward to that moment, because you might have wondered whether maybe the Torah is kind of a miraculous tale of what came before the reality of the Israelite nation and the land. But then once you're in the land, you're grounded, and your wings are clipped, so to speak. But what the event with Chizkiyahu really demonstrates quite roundly, by being the most spectacular deliverance that you find in the rest of Tanakh, is that no, Hashem is always in charge, and circumstances permitting, he will show you his hand again, and that you can merit that as a king who's ruling practically in the land, and not this kind of. I mean, to be fair, the point is that Moshe is a sort of shepherd, prophet, deliverer. He's not a politician in the classical sense. He's not a king who rules in a capital with an agricultural economy that feeds it, and all these things that is what the Israelite nation became and what Chizkiyahu was. And so you might have wondered, you might have said, oh, well, maybe you can have those kinds of nisim, those kinds of wonders for Moshe, but for Chizkiyahu, someone like him, he has to kind of solve his problems with the laws of physics. And it seems that it's quite important in Tanakh, and even quite important to the Torah, to telegraph that no, Hashem is always writing the story and writing it as he sees fit, and the nation can rule in the land through practical means and still merit wondrous deliverance if they're doing enough to turn away from foreign gods and towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's the first point. I think a second point, though, is more complex and more interesting, I think, as far as what we try to get out of the text a little bit, because we still haven't really explained why the serpents, what does this have to do with Cush, and is it really just that this is a big deal, miraculous deliverance because Chizkiyahu was so good at rejecting idolatry, or is something else going on? And I think the way to get at this issue is to ask the following question. Why didn't Jerusalem become Rome? And, obviously, if you ask a certain kind of historian of the classical period, they'll give you their own answer and say something about, oh, well, Rome had the Tiber River and Rome had this many men under arms and whatever. You can make a kind of a technical case of all different kinds for why there were differences. But to be fair, we naturally now look at, reading Tanakh, the situation of the Israelite nation in this little strip of land at the crossroads of three continents, and we say, oh, it's so difficult to hold on to your little patch of territory because you always have these other empires that are kind of steamrolling through and taking over, and how can you ever maintain independence and sovereignty in that situation? So we just take for granted that like we're the little guy, and everyone else is part of some grander project. But why did that come to be the case, right? I mean, everyone starts out little. Rome at some point was a city-state, or even smaller than that, and for a long time was just a regional power, right? When you're talking about the First and Second Punic Wars, we're not even into the point where Rome is really, reaching out and trying to span the known world in the way that it came to eventually. It was a regional Mediterranean power. It had its wars with Carthage, whatever. But it was some time still before Rome really came into its own in like the Augustan sense. And the point is that Rome at one point was much smaller than that, and maybe at a certain point it would have been kind of difficult to look at Jerusalem and look at Rome and say, "Oh, I know these guys here in Rome, they have a future of world conquest, but these people over here in Jerusalem, that's never going to happen." Of course, you can always, again, point to things like no major rivers running through Jerusalem or what have you, but Eretz Israel is at the crossroads of three continents. And so you can look at that as a disadvantage, and you can say, everyone else is going to kind of steamroll you as they roll through on their way to attack another empire. Or you can say, maybe you're at the center of things. Maybe you're in the position, actually, to go out and conquer over here and get a bit of the action over by Mesopotamia, and conquer into Egypt a bit, and conquer up into Asia Minor and Greece or whatever. And before you know it, you're the center of a cosmopolitan empire with lots of trade in the sea and lots of other economies, feeding yours. And it does become a question of disposition. Like, we know that part of the answer is that Am Yisrael were not taught by their Torah, not taught by Hashem, that they should be trying to conquer the world, right? The Torah tells us we have borders, and these are our borders, and we're not thinking about going beyond them. We're not thinking go out there and get as many toys as you can by beating everyone else up and taking theirs. We have a different concept of what our mission on earth is. And so it's, in that sense, obvious why we didn't become Rome. We didn't become Rome because we didn't conceive of our job in the world as being world conquest. And that is, I think, the key point to latch onto here with regard to the contrast with Assyria. Because at some level, because Assyria is this first historical phenomenon of, this true attempt at world conquest in some sense, the encounter between Chizkiyahu and Sancheriv naturally poses the question, why isn't Chizkiyahu besieging Damascus or, Nineveh, or eventually, I don't know, Eretz Shinar and Bavel and whatever. Why is it that he's taking refuge in besieged Jerusalem and not the reverse? And what is it? What is the difference that needs to obtain between outlooks in order for that to be the case? And that's an especially important point for the following reason. It would be one thing if you said, okay, we have this little nation. They want to live in this little strip of land. They believe in pacifism. They believe in not controlling more than X amount of territory. And so their beliefs prevent them from expanding and conquering everyone. But that isn't quite what Am Yisrael believe. Am Yisrael actually believe that their God is the king of all gods, the ruler of all the universe, the only true God, and that really he has unlimited power to help them in whatever they do. And not only that he does want them to spread a message to the world that will eventually take over the entire world's consciousness and, in a sense, rule the world. The trick is he doesn't want them to do that by force. He wants them to do it by example. He wants them to do that by exporting ideas and by convincing people. And as we know historically, that gets complicated because eventually those ideas become, in somewhat bastardized versions, the reigning ideas of other empires that are bent on world domination. And so through Christianity and Islam, you have the much more rapid and much more violent and much more expansive spread of some of the ideas of what you would call biblical monotheism, because they're derived from the Torah, but then also kind of modified and situated within an ideology that does not constrain itself in the way that Ya'adut and the faith of the Israelites always did. And so, let's postpone that part of the discussion for the moment. But the point is, Am Yisrael didn't try to conquer the world, but you might have thought that maybe they would have come to the conclusion that they should, because they would sit and they think, well, who's right? We're right. We believe that we're right. We believe not just that we're right here in our little domain, like everyone else in the world believes in that period that they have their little local gods, and those local gods help them to rule their little local patch of territory, but they wouldn't stray out of it because they don't really know the gods in those other places. This is, a people who believe there's one God and he rules everything that there is, and there's nowhere they can go where he's not in charge. And not only that he wants moral and ethical and religious transformation and an end to idolatry around the world and throughout humanity. And someone could, consider those ideas and say, well, you know what? I think that means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to go out and make everyone behave, right? Go out and make everyone do the right thing. And if I have to kill the ones who won't, then I'll do that. And it'll be great, right? We know that some people have essentially invented ideologies for themselves that work that way. But the question is, why didn't that happen in a sort of Roman fashion in Jerusalem in the time of Chizkiyahu or onward? And I think actually Tanakh really is posing that question for us a little bit, because what it does is it builds that idea into the mirror image of ourselves that we see in the Assyrians. Because there may be a sort of a different case to make about what Assyria was if you're trying to build the case up archaeologically. But through the lens of Tanakh, what Tanakh is going to do is going to use Ashur or Assyria as a foil to make this kind of point to us. So Rav Shakeh is the emissary of Sancheriv. He's calling out to Chizkiyahu at the walls of Jerusalem. He says, this is in Sefer Melachim, in the Book of Kings, Wa'al yiftach etchem Chizkiyahu el Adonai le'emor, Hatzel yetzileni Adonai, Velo tinaten et ha'ir hazot biyad melech Ashur. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely save us, and this city shall not be delivered to the hand of the king of Assyria. Al tishme'u el Chizkiyahu, ki כה אמר מלך אשור, עשו איתי ברכה, וצאו אליי, ויאכלו איש גפנו, ואיש תאנתו, ושתו איש מי בורו. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus said the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me, and come out to me, and then eat every man from his own vine, and every one from his fig tree, and drink every one of the cisterns of his water, the waters of his cistern. So, he's saying, you say, Chizkiyahu says, trust in the Lord and you'll be saved, but no, you're not going to be saved. For the king of Assyria says, don't listen to him, make an agreement with me. And then this phrase, and let every man eat from his own vine and from his own fig tree and his waters and his cistern. That language is so much the language of the Hebrew prophets, right? He's not saying, forget all this stuff, we have a different way of being, come and, eat giraffe with us, because that's how we roll. Or he's not saying, he's not simply threatening and saying, we're going to put all your heads on pikes. He's saying, I have a promise for you if you play ball with me, if you yield to my imperial rule, then I'm promising you very similar things to what Hashem was promising you when he said he would give you this land. It goes on, Ad bo'i we לקחתי אתכם אל ארץ כארצכם, ארץ דגן ותירוש, ארץ לחם וכרמים, ארץ זית יצהר ודבש, וחיו ולא תמותו, ואל תשמעו אל חזקיהו, כי אסית אתכם לאמור אדוני יצילנו. Until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, and a land of oil and olive and honey, that you may live and not die, and listen not to Chizkiyahu when he misleads you, saying the Lord will save us. So this is what the Assyrians did. They took everyone they conquered and they shuffled them around and moved them from place to place. But the point here is that there's an option to cooperate with that, and then the promise is basically, Sancheriv is saying, I am a more reliable God than Hashem, and I can give you all the same things that Hashem is promising you. If you stick with Hashem, you'll die and you'll lose, and you'll have misery and destruction. But if you stick with me, you can have, the olives and the honey and all that stuff, but I'm going to decide where, and it's going to be part of my system. And then he goes on, Hatzel hatzilu Elohei hagoim ish et arzo miyad melech Ashur, Aye Elohei Hamath ve'Arpad, Aye Elohei Sepharwayim, Hena wa'iwa, ki hatzilu et Shamron miyadi. Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharwayim, Hena, and Eva? Have they saved Samaria from my hand? So in other words, he's saying, look, Hashem is not the greatest God, Sancheriv is the greatest God, or the God that Sancheriv serves is the greatest God. And here are all the examples of other gods that weren't powerful enough to stop him. At the end of the day, there's something very much in the way that Ashur is representing itself that sounds a lot like maybe Jerusalem would sound like if they had decided to go on this conquering spree, right? If they had decided one day, you know what, I think Hashem wants us to just conquer the whole world and rule it according to his system, then they would have gone, and let's say they'd been successful, they would have said, well, Hashem's the greatest God, and he defeated this God, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and he defeated that God, he defeated Hamath, the god of Samaria, or whatever, and they would talk in the same terms, and they might even also, have a lot of rhetoric about grapevines and olives and grain and things, because just as those things are bounty of the land of Israel, they're bounty of the land of the rest of the region to a significant degree, and also it's part of the mentality, of Am Yisrael to think in those terms. And so you really might have expected that Sancheriv would sound, or rather that Am Yisrael, and Chizkiyahu would sound like this if they were the ones going around trying to conquer everyone else. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's just because Rav Sheken knows who he's talking to. There's the whole reference to the fact that he's speaking Hebrew. He knows his audience and he's trying to kind of speak to their values. Perhaps. But there's still the question of, well, why is that happening in the text? Why is there such an emphasis on the idea of Assyria speaks the language of Am Yisrael, knows how to talk in Hebrew terms? And I think that has to do with the idea that, let's experiment with the notion that Assyria is not simply some big bully with lots of power, but what if Assyria regards itself as being on a mission, kind of like a Chizkiyahu who wants to conquer the world. And I think that there's more evidence for that if you look for it in the right way. Because, first of all, this whole idea of, we said that serpents were involved in this from the beginning, because the serpent crawls on its belly in Gan Eden. Al Gihon chatelech, you crawl on your belly and you eat the dust of the earth all the days of your life. That's the curse that Hashem gives to the serpent. And also, the Gihon river surrounds the whole land of Cush. But it's interesting, like this idea of Cush as maybe being Ethiopia later in Tanakh, maybe having to do with Nineveh and that region around Iraq. And then you say there's this river that surrounds it all. So it starts to sound kind of like the whole known world. Even if it doesn't involve Ethiopia, it sounds like a big territory. And then if there's a snake crawling on its Gihon, on its belly, but the Gihon is a river that surrounds this huge territory, then that sounds like a serpent that surrounds a huge territory, like the idea of a serpent that surrounds the world. And then it's interesting that the serpent is eating dust all the days of its life. It's like ground hungry. It's hungry to eat the earth. And that now evokes the idea essentially of like insatiable hunger for conquest. So we have now this notion of you have insatiable hunger for conquest, and your Cush, which is Nimrod, which is Bavel, and which is also Assyria, Ashur. And when we remember that Nimrod was this specially mentioned great ruler who founded Nineveh and Ashur in the Torah, and what was he called? He was called a Gibur Tzayid Lifnei Hashem. He was like a great mighty hero and hunter before Hashem. And the Lifnei Hashem there is such a puzzle, because it's how do we connect this guy to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? But Chazal really picked that up and play it to the hilt, because what they make up midrashim about how Nebuchadnezzar, who eventually destroyed the temple and conquered the land of Israel, including Jerusalem, before he did that, he was a scribe in the court of Babylonia. And he went to all these links to make sure that letters were sent to Chizkiyahu that properly honored Hashem. And so it portrays Nebuchadnezzar as this zealous servant of Hashem, which is very bizarre. It's an interesting midrash, but the point is that, or let's say Agidata, I think it maybe appears in the Gemara. But the point is that Chazal are saying to you, don't think of these people as like they have everything wrong. They're just the bad guys. Hashem sends them to punish Am Yisrael because Am Yisrael is doing idolatry, but there's a narrow sense in which they're serving Hashem while attacking Israel, because Israel deserves it in a sense at that moment. But there's a broader sense in which they could, where you could say, maybe Hashem is with them to some degree because they are better than a randomly picked civilization. They have a certain amount of relationship with Hashem. They have some things that they're getting right. There are lots of empires that have spread throughout the world over time, and I don't think you could say about any of them that they did so without figuring out something correct and getting it right, like Law and Order, for example, or having the idea of a society that shows fealty to authority. Those are things which you can have in an evil society that's going to conquer the world, and then Hashem will destroy them. But he's with them because they have something that is part of the package that Hashem is looking for. If they had nothing, then they wouldn't be able to succeed at anything. And so, and moreover, I think you could say with Assyria that it's like, because it has the merit, in a sense, to conquer the known world first, let's consider the idea that they may have more in common with the ideology of Torah than we might first realize. That yes, they're idolaters, and yes, they worship Baal, and you don't want to say they're doing that right. But Tanakh doesn't really get into that much detail about Baal worship and how close Baal worship was to other things that might have been more correct. And so there's this sense in which it wants to play with the idea of, what if Assyria is, yes, they're wrong, yes, they are the bad guys, but they're not totally wrong, meaning maybe they said, we realize there's one God, and, we are so correct about that. And it's so correct for us to bring that system to the world because it will benefit the world for us to conquer the world and force everyone to get in line. That we're going to go out and do that. And Hashem is with them more than he is with, some people, because he says, well, you kind of are correct. It's true that at some level there are things about what Assyria might bring to the world that maybe Hashem agrees with enough that they get this bracha to succeed. And so that even kind of runs like a thread all the way through, where the serpent, this whole idea of the serpent that is like hungry to conquer the world, the serpent is also the staff that Moshe uses to split the sea. And so it becomes both this symbol of temptation into sin, but also this from Gan Eden, but also this symbol of what it can mean for Hashem to be on your side, right? And so it's like the idea that Hashem is on your side is also a dangerous temptation to say, I know what's right and wrong. And, if I know what's right and wrong, then I can conquer the world and bring it into order. But that actually turns out to be a temptation to transgress, because now you're putting yourself in Hashem's place, right? So to summarize, I think the idea is that Assyria makes sense as a kind of a dark mirror image of Am Yisrael. Like, what if we decided to conquer the world and force Torah on the world by force? And what would that look like? It would look like Assyria, perhaps, at least as enough that we see that in the language of the Assyrians and how they talk to Chizkiyahu. We see it also in, as we said, the Chazal picking up on it and emphasizing it in the Gemara. And we also see it in language like in Shirat Hayam, for example. Like, if it's the case that when we read in Shirat Hayam, Ze'eli ve'anweo, this is my God and I will make a habitation for him, like referring to building the temple. If that's how we're talking, then what would Nineveh be? What would the capital of Assyria, the city of Nineveh, what would that mean? It would mean we will make a habitation for him, right? In other words, no, you're not going to build a house for Hashem. We're going to build a house for Hashem. Like, we have the ruler of the universe on our side, and we will decide where to build a house for him. And that is our motivation and the sort of core of our ideology. Now, this isn't quite trying to make a claim like, oh, we know now about the Assyrians that they were biblical monotheists who wanted to conquer the world. I don't think that one wants to make the case that way. It's, again, the idea is Tanakh is interested in a sense of, if Chizkiyahu is a king and his job as king of Judah is really to bring the world to Hashem, then if he's not trying to conquer the whole world, then what's he supposed to be doing? And the text is helping to make that point by showing that Ashur, in some sense, is this wrong version of Torah that tries to conquer the world by force and bring it under the order of some kind of high God that rules over all. And so Chizkiyahu can withstand the siege and be miraculously delivered because he's keeping faith with the true Torah and with Hashem and doing it Hashem's way. So in one sense, we have to see that failed, warped commitment to some kind of global order dashed on the rocks of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unlimited might, because he uses that might to protect this little tiny country that refuses to go along with this global order. But also, we see it in the aftermath of that, where Chizkiyahu withstands the siege of Jerusalem, and there's a great miracle, and then he also gets ill himself, and then is cured, and then the kings of Bavel come to investigate the wonder, right? And ostensibly it's because they heard that he was sick and then he was healed, but I think it's clear that that also is about the wonder of the deliverance of Jerusalem, that it's showing that Chizkiyahu is given an opportunity to be an ambassador to the world because he withstood the might of the Assyrian Empire. So instead of saying, okay, if you want to bring the world to Hashem, then go out and try to conquer the world. That is the failure of the Assyrian model, is that it tries to bring the world to Hashem by force. And obviously there were also Christian and Islamic versions of that since then that conquered huge parts of the world and converted a bunch of people by force. And they had some traction, but they also kind of collapsed under their own weight and were in other ways very corrupted and very unsuccessful, because it kind of doesn't work if you try to just go around the entire globe with the fire and sword and bring people to Hashem. You end up bringing people to something else. You bring people to a substitute for Hashem that can accommodate itself to your hunger for global domination. So, on the one hand, Chizkiyahu is being shown to be able to withstand the might of that failed attempt at world domination because he's keeping faith with Hashem and getting rid of idols and not accepting the idols of those who seek to dominate the globe. But that turns into an opportunity to teach about HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the world. And this idea that Bavel came to Yerushalayim to find out about what happened, clearly there's some kind of missed opportunity there because Bavel ultimately becomes the enemy. They come and conquer Jerusalem and burn the temple and take Am Yisrael into captivity. But that happens because of the accumulated effect of all the idolatry that Bnei Yisrael do, including in the generation after Chizkiyahu with his son Menashe. And so there's this sense that there's a near miss, but it's really not a near miss. I think the point is like that the nation didn't have the maturity to do what it needed to at that moment. Like it's showing you the mechanism, but it's also showing you like they weren't ready in the way that the spies, the people weren't ready to go into the land the first time they saw it. So here it's like Chizkiyahu is king in the land. He tries to keep faith with Hashem. He does that perfectly. HaKadosh Baruch Hu rewards him with tremendous miracles. Those miracles in turn show the world, wow, those Jews, they're standing strong. The king of all the universe is with them. I want in on that action. I want to find out about it. I'm going to come with interest and with respect to find out about it. And then the question is, how well do they do their job of being priests to the world and bringing the world to Hashem? Clearly, Chizkiyahu in that regard failed. Chazal say about him that if he had succeeded by making song in praise of Hashem, then he would have been Melech HaMashiach. Like he would have been some kind of culmination of the Davidic line that leads to a transformation of the human condition, perhaps, although that may be kind of loading the idea of Mashiach up with things that don't necessarily belong there. But in any case, it's like Chizkiyahu had that chance, and the sort of the history of Tanakh is littered with missed opportunities that lead to failure and learning and redevelopment. So that was one such moment. But the point is that Chizkiyahu was on his way to showing how this is supposed to work. You don't bring the world to Hashem by conquering the world by force. You bring the world to Hashem by withstanding the aggression of all the people who are wrong to try to conquer the world by force, whether it be the jihadists or the Americans or the EU or anyone else who wants a global order that dances to their tune and is actually willing to threaten Am Yisrael each in their way in order to get that to happen, that if we are good enough at standing strong and turning away from all of their false gods and keeping our faith with Hashem, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises us to have our back. But what we have to remember is even if that happens, Bezrat Hashem, and we're so blessed as to have that kind of success and wondrous deliverance, that is not a blank check or not simply a gift. That is a loan, in a sense. And the way we pay it back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is we use the success and the reputation that comes from that success as a springboard to act in our role as Mamlechet Kohanim, as a nation of priests that should be teaching the world about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and bringing the world to him. So that's the thing that was maybe, incomplete in the life of Chizkiyahu. And that's where, Bezrat Hashem, we perhaps can succeed in the future. But I think at any rate, what it really makes clear is we're now talking about things that are the highest stakes possible as far as the Torah and Tanakh are concerned. And it makes perfect sense that Shirat Hayam could refer forward to that moment, because it's not just anticipating some time in the future when there'll be another big miraculous deliverance. It's anticipating the temple, for one thing. Shirat Hayam is about the temple. And what is the purpose of the temple? What's the purpose of Jerusalem? Chizkiyahu is a king of Judah who scours the temple of idols and rededicates it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and is ruling in the land and standing against the idolatry of the rest of the world, including attempts at global domination by idolaters who maybe even only slightly disagree with him at some level, like who may, for the purposes of argument, Tanakh is saying they claim to believe in God almost like yours and make promises almost like the promises that your God makes. And it's very tempting to just go along with their program. But no. Chizkiyahu shows us that we can maintain sovereignty in our own land, and we can do so against the pressure of the world around us, and sort of powers trying to dominate the globe of all kind. And that when we do that, the stakes are as high as can be, because this is about our mission as a nation. The purpose of the temple is to be a house of prayer for all nations, and the purpose of Yerushalayim is to be this broadcasting point for Torah that's supposed to go out to the whole world. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah u'davar Adonai Yerushalayim. So that concept has to, at some level, be threaded into Shirat Hayam, because Shirat Hayam is the moment where Hashem creates the Jewish people as a nation and says, I'm going to save you from Paro, I'm going to set you free so you can serve me. And what does it mean to serve me? It means that you need to go to this land, you need to rule this land, you need to control it, you need to defend it. I will give you unlimited support in miraculous help defending this land and holding on to it if you commit to me in my Torah. And ultimately the purpose of that is so that you can be a conduit, so that you can be a link between me and the rest of humanity, and you can do that by teaching, you can do that by example, you can do that by rejecting idols, and you're not going to do it by force. You're not going to do it by the fire and the sword and trying to conquer the whole world in the manner of other benighted and foolhardy kind of spin-offs of this system. The Torah system is one where you stick with Hashem, you have patience, you have humility in what you attempt to do with your own hands by force, and ultimately, Kadosh Baruch Hu's wondrous deliverance is what's going to bring other people to you looking to learn something, and you need to be ready to teach them.